Hello, everyone, and welcome to Phoenix Gaming. I'm your host, Nick Henning, and today we are talking about some Ark Nova strategy. If you've been to my channel before, you know that I do some Frosthaven strategy videos. I've also done a handful of the World Series of Board Gaming finals commentary. This is my first actual just straight up strategy video where I'm just kind of talking to you about my opinions about something. And so what we're talking about with Ark Nova today is card upgrades. There's a lot going on in this game. We're just going to talk about this one narrow aspect of this game, and it is the 5 different cards that you can upgrade. These are your action cards that take place over the course of the game. And every single one of these, let's be honest, right at the beginning, every single one of these is circumstantial. You got to pay attention to the board state. What card is valuable to flip at what time totally depends on what you have available to you, what you need. And so paying attention to that is more important than any kind of guide I'm going to throw up here. But maybe a few things that I'll say today will make you reconsider or start considering these cards in a different way in terms of evaluating them. So I'm going to start off with a bang. My favorite card to flip, rank 1, best card to flip, is the cards card. This is because this game is about playing a deck of cards. You have a giant stack of cards to pull from, and cards is not an exciting action. When you take this action, all you just do is draw cards on your turn, and that's basically in your turn. This is not a payoff action. But the difference in a unflipped cards to a cards card, to me, is well worth it. I think that it is the most kind of bang for my buck in terms of what an upgraded version of this card does. I'm sorry that my cat is whining on the side here. But as you can see, essentially, if we compare these really quickly, actually, maybe I could just make a copy and then we'll flip them over so we can compare side by side sort of a flipped cards and an unflipped cards. All right, here we go. So if you are looking, kind of focusing on the 4 and 5 side of these cards, you can see that you're going to be drawing essentially one more card at level 5, right? Draw 4, discard 1. So you're getting 3 cards quantity and seeing 4 cards. At the level 4 tier, you're just seeing one more card, but you're keeping the same number of cards. At the level 3 tier, you are drawing 2 cards and not having to discard them. So at the odd tier, essentially 3 and 5, you're getting to draw 1 additional card, which I think is very well worth it. Further, if you really need to snap something off the board, you can do that starting from the 3 slot of the cards action. That stuff is all good and fine. That's just a nice, solid upgrade. But I actually think the thing that puts the cards card over the top for me is its interaction with reputation. So with the cards card flipped over, the pink version of this card allows you to draw from cards within your reputation range, which you cannot do with a base card. This is a really common rules mistake that I see people making. You have to have this flipped over in order to interact essentially with the conveyor belt, the tableau, in the way that you maybe instinctually think that you'd be able to do so in this game. And having that control is a really, really big deal. I have found in my experience that taking at least one decent card off the conveyor belt is a good way to kind of play safely, and then you draw off the top, hoping to draw into something pretty sexy that can maybe make your game plan develop from where you're going at that point. So flipping cards gives you a lot of options. Options let you make your kind of pathway towards victory at the end. And the other thing about cards is that it also allows you to advance past the 9 reputation part of the, where are we go? Reputation. Here we go. The level 9 reputation part of the track. You can now go into the 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15 part. Again, another common rules mistake that people kind of miss. But this level here, these rewards are pretty nice for the reputation that you're getting at this point. So to that point, cards is best when you have a strong reputation kind of zoo, which you might have based on the rewards that you have on the board, the cards that you played. If you played like spokesperson, for instance, which is insane for reputation. If you kind of focused more on universities rather than partnership zoos, you probably have a higher reputation than other players at the table. Those kinds of synergies will really benefit the person who has flipped the cards card. Now, even though this is my favorite card, I don't flip it all the time. I did just play a game where I flipped 4 cards and cards was not one of them. Unfortunately, I did lose that game, so it's maybe a bad example. But there are two things that you need to consider about when you flip cards that I think make it not as good. One is the storage space issue. Between every break, you can only keep 3 cards in your hand unless you've taken that university that bumps your hand size up to 5. So just drawing piles of cards is not necessarily going to be helpful. It lets you see more. It does open up your options still, but managing your hand can be very difficult if you don't have a way to keep those cards in hand or use them. If you're playing the crane map or the commercial harbor map is what it's called, or you have, a sunbather that you're planning on using, then by all means, flipping this card is still very good, as you can do a whole lot with those additional things that you draw. You can discard them for money and so on and so forth. But if you don't have a way to do them, just drawing extra stuff and pitching it into the bin is not quite as good. So I would maybe wait on flipping this if I had those kinds of concerns in the way. The other time that I don't end up flipping the cards, I often flip this first, like pretty early in the game, because again, it just increases the number of options that I have, kinds of things that I can see. It also does depend on sort of what the conveyor belt looks like. If the conveyor belt's full of decent cards, then I'm more likely to flip this early. If it's full of a bunch of junk that I don't care about, less likely to flip it early. But if you already have a pretty strong hand and your game plan is kind of together, well, then flipping this is not really as important. I think in most games, you will have a decent game plan for the first sort of fraction of the game, but it's only going to last for a certain amount of time. So those are things that I would consider when I was thinking about not flipping the cards card. I also think that this is a card that really benefits from flipping earlier in the game. It's still fine just as a value flip kind of in the middle of the game. And if you need to unlock the sort of higher tier reputation, then you might flip it near the end of the game. But having it as your last flip in the game is usually a pretty bad feeling. So that's cards. Number 1 ranked card. Let's talk animals for number 2. This card used to be my least favorite and has recently moved up into my number 2 ranking for upgraded cards. The reason is because I end up flipping this card just about every single game. I don't think that this card should be your first flip in most instances. There are few exceptions, but this is the card that I often have as my 3rd flip throughout the course of the game. Why is that? I enjoy the additional reputation that this card gives you. Other cards give you sort of the boost of, increasing the strength of the card by 1. So cards allows you to draw 1 additional card. Sponsors allows you to play at something 1 level higher than the level that you're kind of cashing in the strength of the card at. Animals gives you reputation. It gives you something kind of outside of the scope of what it normally does. So it's a nice little perk that I think actually can add up quite a lot. You could probably tell from the fact that cards is my number 1 favorite flipped card that I like to have a high reputation in the game. I think that you can do a lot with being the highest reputation zoo and kind of controlling the flow of the card river. And this allows you to kind of maintain that, get those perks along the way there, getting to that level 5 for the additional card flip, getting to that level 8 for the additional association worker, and then the 10 through 15 ones that I was just going agog about before. Flipping animals lets you get those additional reputation points that you need to get up to those levels and really cash in on it. So I like flipping it kind of in the middle of the game for that reason. I often wind up flipping this card second these days if there's not something in particular that I'm doing with my other card flips, just to get the extra 1 or 2 reputation along the way. It's not a big deal. I think the biggest deal about this card, though, is the fact that it is just stronger in the late game. The base animals card, which you can see below in blue, only lets you play 2 animals at the strength 5 level. And this allows you to, if you have a bunch of money, cash in it at strength 3, and then very quickly with a couple X's or just a few turns later, play 2 more animals. So if you have kind of crafted a really good game plan, have a lot of money on hand, but don't have the tempo as much, I've multiple times regretted not flipping my animals card to allow me to do that. Finally, I don't often take the actions that let you do something from reputation range, but it can be really good, right? It's totally circumstantial. It depends on if things have kind of come down the river, if you have the money to pay for the additional kind of where it is along the ranking here. And because there are more animals in the deck than anything else, this is the card that you are most likely to use that reputation range play option compared to all the other upgrade cards. Let's talk about a few of the animals that you can only interact with, come on, TTS. You can only interact with when you have the upgraded animals card. So I think one of the strongest here are the eagles. They're so big. The eagles are the strongest because taking another action is just really, truly incredible. Also, if you have an aviary, they don't take up much space in your zoo. Almost all of these, by the way, are 4s and 5s. I don't think there's the cobra, which is a 2, but generally they're big guys. So both of the eagles, I think, are really nice end game payoffs. Your elephants for drawing additional cards are very expensive. They're cool when you can pull them off, but it can be hard to make this work. Rhino also is pretty strong, although obviously I like the other rhino a little bit more because it has a little bit less of a prerequisite for buying it, essentially. And I've found more and more often that drawing an unused base conservation project, if I'm not doing this in the middle of the game, I might not even have the actions left to kind of cash in on this. So something to consider. This is not always a slam dunk, but this bonus is a very nice bonus. I don't want to underplay it. I just think that it is not as strong as I always think. The animal that has really come up for me is this dummy, the New Zealand fur seal, who lets you get an association worker. And I think one of the most fundamental questions you're asking yourself in this game is, how am I getting a second association worker? The third one's, helpful too, but the second one is really the one that matters. And if you don't have a good pathway towards doing that, flipping animals early and playing a New Zealand fur seal can completely change your game flow. For that reason, this is a card that I pay attention to a lot more than I had ever historically. I think it's pretty bad later in the game. There's a few instances where you'd play it. Obviously, everything is circumstantial, but mostly I think that it is beneficial to play very early, and it's one of the reasons why I would flip animals on the early side, is to kind of let myself have that additional association worker when I couldn't before. You might ask, why did I not put the bears in here? The bears also have the full-throated ability, but it's because the bears also have predator prerequisites, and the whole advantage of this guy is that I can get him down earlier in the game where I don't have the prerequisites necessarily needed except for that upgraded animals card. That's number 2, our friend, the upgraded animals card. Here's my controversial pick. I put build as rank number 3. I know a lot of people who think that build is the essentially the one card that must be flipped in the course of a game, the one card that is generally the most advantageous to flip over at the beginning. I see this card flipped over the most commonly and the earliest amongst flips. I don't think that this card is bad. I mean, maybe part of the reason I just put it as rank 3 is because it's not as fun for me. I do think that people overrate this card a little bit. So I'm going to talk about what's good about this card, and then I'm going to talk about what I think are some of the traps about this card. So what's good about this card? The ability to dump a bunch of small buildings, kiosks, pavilions as part of your build along the way gets you just a couple other incidental bonus appeal points, gets you a couple additional dollars that you're going to make as your income thanks to those kiosks along the way. Also, the kiosks are inherently more powerful when you have your build card flipped because you can build multiple things around them, whereas if you don't have a flipped build card, building kiosks is usually a kind of sillier thing to do because you're not going to have that many things touching the kiosks. You also essentially can't play a small animals strategy without having the build card flipped. That is, I think, something that is very valuable to consider when you're thinking about flipping the build card. I think that also build is it. There are some rare games where you can flip a card before the first break is over. And in those games, far and away, flipping build is the best thing that you can do because you can get those kiosks and pavilions down early, which really boosts your income in a way that other players are going to struggle to keep up with just from the functional builds that you're doing alone. So I think as a very, very early card, the earlier you flip build, the better off you're going to be. For me, I often get into situations where if I'm not flipping build first or second, I will not end up flipping the build card later in the game. Now, I was also talking in animals about how I like to play multiple animals at a time. And so another thing you have to consider with the build card is, if I'm not flipping build, do I have other ways of putting buildings in the game? You might have that conservation that lets you put 2-space enclosures. You might be releasing animals back into the wild, which opens up your enclosures. Maybe you have a way to cheat a large bird aviary or reptile house into play without having a build card flipped over. Those are all ways that you can kind of get around. I think if you can essentially cash in on even one of those things that I said, you don't need to flip build card in the game. However, if you don't have any of those things, you probably are going to want to flip this at some point along the way. So it sits on an interesting, crucial teeter-totter. I mean, you can get away also with not flipping this card if you have kind of a really good large animals draw, just 3s, 4s, and 5s, and you just end up building those really big enclosures, and that's what you do your build actions for, and that totally works. Reasons I don't love flipping the build card. First of all, I think that there is a trap. The 7 points you get for filling your zoo are nice, but I don't think players in general should count on getting that. It is an incidental bonus that you might get by having done this journey of building things along the way. But rushing or really forcing your zoo to be covered is, I think, a real pain in the butt. If you're playing at a little bit of a tighter table, the game should end before anybody without support, even with the build card flipped, can fill their entire board out. So what do I mean by support? I mean like sponsors that put additional kind of tiles into play, or having the conservation bonus that I mentioned earlier, the place an additional 2-space enclosure. But it feels a little goofy placing additional 2-spaces enclosures when you've already flipped the build tile over. So I much prefer to kind of have some sponsors that are going to support the build along the way. I also think that another thing to consider is the immediacy question. People rush towards flipping build because they're very excited. It is very powerful. But if you don't have the money to support it at the beginning of the game, before the first break, before the second break, money is tightest in this game. And you might have a plan of playing out a certain animal, and if you don't have the money to then take advantage of this like flipped build card, well, something else, any of the other cards that I've mentioned so far, or will mention after this, have powers that can't be used. This card is the one card that is strictly gatekept by how much money you have. I guess you could argue that animals is the same that way. So 2 cards that are strictly gatekept by how much money you have on hand. So that's something else to consider when you're flipping build. So I've put it at rank 3 because I don't think that it needs to be used quite as often as I think others think that it needs to be used. But I will say getting this flipped early and sort of building out to increase your income is one of the most powerful things you can do with this card. I just think that flipping it later on usually winds up being a trap. Association has taken an unprecedented fall. When I was playing this game in the early days, I think that Association for me was the rank 1 card. It was a card that I wanted to flip first on the table, and make sure that I got to flip a card before other people because of what this did. I definitely overvalued it at the time, and it has dropped down more and more the more and more I have played this game. Let's start off by talking about why it's great. First of all, the money to points ratio, spending $2 for a conservation point is amazing. Spending $5 for a conservation point is amazing. However, 7, 10, 12, those start to get to values that are not quite as great depending on how much cash you have on hand. Some games you're going to end with a ton of money, and you really wish that you had the money to throw at Association. But it can put a real kind of constraint on your money circumstances, depending on what animals you're playing, depending on if other people are venoming you or anything like that. But that money to points conversion early is really, really valuable. The partner zoo situation with this, getting a third partner zoo, I don't think is that big a deal in the getting the third partner zoo. However, I do want to point out what I actually think is the most significant and the primary reason that I actually flip Association these days is this barrier of going from sort of the second to the third partner zoo always gives a reward of an association worker. And I was talking before about how important I think an association worker is. Getting that second one is very, very important. It's not ideal if you partner Zood as association actions. Maybe you have some other sneaky way of getting one. And then on your kind of after the second break, your third association action gets you then another association worker. It's not the ideal circumstance, but it's better than not being able to get that second association worker. And so if I find myself with limited options, this ends up becoming the default go-to. And actually, for me, is the primary reason why I wind up flipping the association card these days. I also think that one of the things that is a little bit understated about the value of association is the ability to take two actions. You can have one or more different association tasks with the total maximum value of X. This is the card that more than any other card, you see people throwing a bunch of X's and they're going to do a conservation action and a partner zoo or something like that. One of the things that I actually just end up liking doing with this the most is if I had just done that flip that I had mentioned, where I flipped it so that my action, let me just go back here. I flipped it so that I have the ability to do this. And then I go to a level 5 action for association. I'll spend 3 of those points to get this partner zoo. And then I have 2 remaining, which I can use to do the 2 reputation action, which is a really nice way of converting this association that would have been an association 5 kind of downgraded, as it were, to just getting a partnership zoo at 3 and actually getting to do 2 things along the way with it. Those are the things that are cool about association. Yes, you can buy a conservation project off of reputation range. I don't see that happening very often. Usually people nab those before it's there, or you nab it because you're worried that someone's going to take it off the board. It does come into play every once in a while, but not often enough that it'd be a real consideration in flipping this card for me. Reasons why I don't end up liking association as much as I historically did, why it's down to rank 4. First of all, it is money needy. If you are spending 7 or 10, and you don't have to spend 7 or 10, but it just feels bad to have this perk that you can't use. That is one of the main perks, I think, of the association flipped card. And so when you get to that point, you don't have the money to use it. That's a bit of a bummer. It will end up getting you a couple additional conservation points, though, from doing that. So it's valuable. You just need to make sure you're considering what the cost is of that money, literally. The other thing is that this is a card that very much losing the race makes a big difference. The first person to flip association, or really the first person who gets to take an association action after flipping the association, is the one who really gets the sweet deal, the 2-for-1, and then oftentimes they get one of the 5-for-1s as well. If you get both the 5-for-1s, that's amazing. But being the second person in is okay, but being the third person in or the fourth person in to get association really sucks. If you're playing a 2-player game, you're mostly doing it for that like head-to-head nature of it, but it doesn't feel great to be the second person to flip association in a 2-player game. It might end up just being one of those situations where it's like, oh, I'm competing with it, so they don't get the kind of cheap conservation bonuses. And then the last thing is I talked about how great it is that you can take multiple actions with the donations. But the reality is that once you hit kind of the midpoint of the game, your goal really is to just do a 5 conservation action. I think most of the rest of the game, this game has a pretty steep tail towards building a system or an income engine or anything like that towards scoring points. And a lot of the game is about scoring points. And so if you can take a conservation action, it's almost always better than getting another university or another zoo after you've even flipped some of the cards. I don't value flipping cards as much as I think other folks do, but I think that getting points is always important. So in order to take advantage of that, you're going to need to have a pile of X's to make it work. And so I've just found that more often than not flipping association has really worked for me almost as well. And I get more edge out of the other cards that I'm flipping along the way. But it does, however, have the most upside of all the cards that I've talked about. Poor lonely sponsors. I put them at rank 5. Didn't want to do it. I really tried to convince myself that I wanted to put this one higher. I think I like sponsors more than a lot of other people do. I think there are a lot of circumstances in which sponsors is very good, but I put it at rank 5 because as a base card in a vacuum, I'm not going to assume that I'm going to flip sponsors over the course of the game. And generally by the mid game, if I haven't flipped sponsors, it's not worth it to flip sponsors anymore. So it's great when it's great, but it's just by default not very good, which is what puts it at rank 5 for me. So let's talk about what's great about it. The action tempo on having essentially it being able to X+1 itself to do something a step above is pretty sweet. So first of all, you can, jump the gun with sponsors and manipulate your card row in a way. I think with this card, really more than any other card, this is the only card that sort of lets you cheat rank, I think, in a way that no other card does, except for, you could argue, the cards card, giving you +1 card draw or something like that is kind of like this maximum value here. There's also a fair number of sponsors in the deck that you can buy from reputation range, and having the X+1 there, people will sometimes just forget that you can buy kind of out of sequence like that. So that +1 sometimes just throws people off anyway. So there's some value in that. The sponsor cards in this game are the most busted of the cards in the game. The ones that are really good are really good. The ones that are kind of meh are pretty meh. But there's no animal card that I'm more excited to see than some of the most powerful sponsors cards. So sponsors allowing you to force out those cards is pretty great. Second of all, there's something just really, really appealing about getting double the money for when you break. It's only $3 to $5 extra, but it feels really good. And can be a way that you sort of make the difference if you're a little sort of behind in income from other players, particularly if you flip sponsors. There's a decent chance that you haven't flipped build. And so being able to get that additional money can kind of put you on parity with the other players. So that is a really good power. In fact, I think on paper, that bottom break gain double the money is the most impacted difference any of these cards have from their base versions. However, sponsors is just so draw dependent. You need to have the cards to make it work. You want to have the cards that, require sponsors, or are the level 6 sponsors, or a bunch of level 3 sponsors, because you can play multiple at the same time. I often find that I struggle to draw sponsors cards when I flip this card. I'll flip it because I want to play a specific card, and then I end up just not drawing any sponsors of value throughout the course of the game. And then I end up just doing this as like a, break and get some money, which is not a good feeling anyway. And so if I'm so concerned about my draw, then I kind of want to just be flipping cards instead, so I can draw into good sponsors that I can just play with the base version of this card that I maybe need to throw an X at along the way. I think the value also of this tempo, that getting to do the +1 thing, declines over the course of the game as really the association action and the animals action become more crucial than really anything else that you're doing. So the limitations of when this card doesn't work are what put it a little bit behind for me. But again, I mean, the most powerful cards you can play in this game are the sponsors. I'm going to show you the ones that will make me flip this card first. These are the 3 cards that are going to make me consider flipping this card first. And it's really these 2. Basic research, we'll start with this one because I'm not so sure about this one, but it can give you a lot of conservation points just for having played a couple animals. And sure, some other people get some money, but who really cares about that? This can, if you're struggling to find conservation points in any way, this can give you a whole pile of them in a way that you couldn't have. So that gets my attention. These other 2, however, are the ones that I really care about. Talented Communicator, I've already talked about how much I like the full-throated ability, having an additional association worker. If you do not have a way of getting one, an early sponsors flip that lets you play Talented Communicator and getting your second association worker is big game. And getting to 9 reputation is not usually that difficult to pull off in a game, so it's also worth a conservation point at the end. Pretty awesome. I'm happy to take this card. I used to value it a lot less, but I was wrong. But this card, Explorer, is my vote for actual best card in the game. If you haven't played with it yet, try to go out of your way to play with it. It is just absolutely nutty. It just does so much work for you immediately later in the game. It just generates a lot of bonuses, points, money along the way. feels really good, feels really satisfying. If I have Explorer in my opening hand, I'm probably flipping Sponsors first to make sure this card gets into play. I only picked 3 cards, and so you might be like, well, that's not very exciting. Like, I specifically picked cards that have the prerequisite. There are lots of great cards that don't have these prerequisites, and the most powerful of them are usually the science cards. So if you're kind of going on a science, like research strategy, you have a couple of those in your hand, then upgrading Sponsors, again, might be something that is of value there. Now, I ranked these cards 1 through 5, but that being said, they're all good. Nothing is like really wrong in any of these ways here, and I think everything is based on what your kind of current game plan is, but hopefully by talking through these, you've got a couple additional considerations that you're thinking about while you're looking at your card upgrades. Let me know in the comments. Do you agree? What's your ranking for each of these 5 cards? When do you see them being kind of most important? The card that you like the least? When do you end up flipping that card, or do you never do that? I find myself being very, very flexible and fluid. How important are card flips to you? I see a lot of players really pushing to flip 4 cards in a game. I'm a 3 flipped card kind of guy, and I've been experimenting with strategies that have just 2 flipped cards. So I don't know how essential they are. I haven't quite figured that out yet, but maybe you have some thoughts about that. Hope you enjoyed this video, and we'll talk to you soon. Thanks. Bye, everyone.